In this video, I'll talk about what I learned about painting landscapes. I'm still a beginner, and this palette really helped me out. I'm going to be working with the Rembrandt Landscape palette, and this is my second attempt at painting something Lord of the Rings inspired with this set. I've learned a lot of things along the way, and I'm really excited to share that information with you. Here's the selection of 12 colors that I swatched from the palette that we'll be using today. I'm going to be painting on a 5x7 block by Rembrandt. It's 140-pound cold press paper. Of course, we're going to be using the Rembrandt Landscape Selection palette. I'm going to use a variety of different brushes by Princeton and also Dynasty. You'll just want some rounds and also a flat. I'm going to be using a pencil and ruler, a water mister to get my paints wet, some acrylic ink by Amsterdam, and also a mixing well. This is the reference photo that I'll be painting from today. It's actually taken from the Shire set in New Zealand. I'm going to begin by sketching on my block. It's always helpful to do a grid, even if it's a really big grid. So I just quartered my reference photo into 4 different quadrants, and from there I began placing my lines. A lot of people don't do this step, but it is really helpful for making sure that you have everything generally in the right place. Especially because for this image there's a lot of detail. It always helps to start with lighter lines, and then once you're confident with your placement, you can make that line a little bit darker. I wanted to paint directly from a reference photo this time, and I wanted to choose something that had a whole bunch of green in it to really push the limits of this palette and see what a different landscape I can create from the last time we painted Mordor together. I started out by plugging in, flat areas of color just to help differentiate where everything was and begin my placement. And as you can see, I'm starting pretty transparent, just trying to figure out how everything will build up against each other. I'm definitely going to plug in some of the lighter objects like the flowers first. With watercolor, we're going to try to work light to dark here with some exceptions. But the reason that we want to make sure to plug in those lighter values is because we're going to need to use the white of the paper for that. So for the objects in the background, I'm trying to keep them pretty loose, and the objects up front, I'm really working to make those a little bit tighter, have crisper lines. The closer an object is, the more detail it's going to have, and the farther away, the less detail it's going to have. I also tried adding a little bit of the cerulean blue, which is the color that I used for the sky, in almost everything that was in the far background of this painting. I think that really helped with the atmospheric perspective. Cerulean blue is a rich blue pigment with green undertones. It's very stable and light fast. It's also a single pigmented color, and it's very opaque. Traditionally, it has been used to paint skies ever since the 1800s. I'd like to highlight a couple more of the colors that I used throughout the palette. Next up is blue violet. This is a really dark color at first glance, but it's actually quite transparent. I ended up using it in the majority of my shadows. You can build it up to have a really dark hue, or you can water it down to give it a really subtle effect. Next up is phthalo green. This is a synthetic pigment, and it is a very high intensity color. It is a cool green, so it's wonderful that it was included as one of the colors in this palette, as you'll be able to just plug it in wherever you see any cool green. For my shadows, I ended up using this phthalo green plus the blue violet to get my darkest shadows. In the last video when I was painting Mordor, I was really upset that there wasn't a neutral tint or a black or a Payne's gray in this palette, but upon using it further, I think that it's actually pretty wonderful that there's no black in this palette. You'll just need to mix the complementary colors together, or you're going to need to be more deliberate with your darker hues and values for your shadows. I did end up using a little bit of acrylic ink in this painting. I wanted to showcase the palette, so I just stuck with the one additional add-in, which is the acrylic ink. The acrylic ink allows me to mix the colors into the titanium white ink, and it gives it a whole new level of opacity. So I'm able to go through and brighten up areas or layer a brand new color over top with pretty good coverage. It's almost similar to using gouache. So I really enjoy the ink. It allows me to clean things up and also place lighter colors back in. All of the colors within this set are very transparent. It's wonderful for adding thin layers and building up beautiful colors. However, if you need to go back through and add a lighter color on top, the only way you'll be able to do that is by lifting the paint or by covering over it with something more opaque, in this case, acrylic ink. By refining your edges and adding more layers, you are creating more depth within your painting. Acrylic ink is a wonderful way to do that. Here's what I learned about the foliage. I tried to do all sorts of different bushes by doing different brush strokes. The plants in the immediate foreground and close to the fence have the most detail. You can see more of the individual leaves and stems. And then for most of the shrubs, it was just short, choppy, almost dots, stamping using the side of my brush. The farther away your foliage is, the softer of an edge you'll want it to have. And the closer up it is, the more of a silhouette you'll want it to have. I think especially for a painting like this, you're going to want to have a lot of different variety in your plants. It's going to help keep things separate and also create extra interest. After plugging in my initial shapes of the plants to establish where they went, I wanted to add a little bit more form. So I found myself going through and adding shadows using the blue-violet and the phthalo green. Using a detail brush, I plugged this dark mixture of color into the lower half of the shrubs and plants. That way, it looks like there's a little bit of shadow being undercast by the bush, and it helps give it a little bit of form. So be sure to plug that into your plant blobs. Now I'm just going to remove my paper off of the block, just sliding my fingers around underneath where that paper is glued on the edges. Just take your time and be careful. So here's the end result. Overall, I'm pretty excited about this palette. I really enjoyed using it, and I think that the color selection ultimately helped me figure out how to paint landscapes. As you can see, there's a pretty crazy range in this palette. You can get a whole bunch of different purples, grays, and soft blues, or also all those warm yellows and greens. I'm excited to try painting even more landscapes. If you have any suggestions or ideas of what to paint, definitely let me know down in the comments. One last thing before I say goodbye, I do want to talk about how you can just quickly clean off your palette while your paint is still wet. You may want to do this especially if you're using acrylic ink. Just use a little bit of water and a rag and wipe out those mixing wells. Be sure to leave your watercolor palette open for a couple hours after using it so that you don't create mold. Thanks for watching, guys, and have a great week.